Mexico sees a soaring demand for Chinese-made EVs, which offer good prices and new techs. Has you rethinking your next car? You'll find out why Chinese electric models win on price and features, and why Canada's auto sector faces a very different fate. You'll see why BYD and MG dealers pop up on every corner in Mexico. Prices start around $22,000 and get you 450 kilometers of range, smart driver aids, and over-the-ear updates. That price tech mix flipped the market. You're going to get the backstory on Mexico's rise and a clear comparison to Canada's looming auto exit. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss any auto updates. Comment on your top EV pickup for 2025. Let's talk about prices and why Mexico races ahead while Canada stalls. In late 2024, Mexico lifted strict caps on Chinese EV imports. Dealers stocked showrooms with BYD, JAC, and MG models priced from $22,000 to $30,000, and that undercut local rivals by 25 to 30%. Within 3 months, EV sales jumped 90% year on year. 2/3 of those sales went to Chinese brands. You get a compact hatch with 350 kilometers for just $22,000. A mid-size sedan with 500 kilometer range lists at about US $28,000. Those are prices that challenger brands in the United States and Europe can't match. You save on sticker costs and still get front and rear parking sensors, adaptive cruise control, and lane keep assist. Chinese automakers control key battery materials, and they refine more than half of the world's lithium and cobalt. To explain more, we're going to take a look at Shanghai Eye YouTube channel, and they will explain all that is happening in Mexico right now. Take a look at this.
Mexicans seeking to purchase new vehicles this year have many choices of brands and available technology. The country is located near the massive U.S. market and always ranks among the top 10 vehicle manufacturers in the world. Among global automakers, this Latin American giant is considered a sophisticated and highly competitive market. Since 2020, Chinese automakers have increased their presence in Mexico, and Chinese-made vehicles have been on the rise here. President of BYD Mexico, Ray Zhu, sees significant opportunities for increasing sales in Mexico. He says this is true for light vehicles using combustion engines and fully electric pickup trucks.
Based on the data, I think in Mexico every year there are about between 15% of 18% of the new cars sold are pickup, which means annually it has the potential to have more than 200,000 units pickup. So this is a big, huge market.
For more than 15 years, Mexico has charged a 20% tariff on all vehicles imported into the country, but that has not deterred the rising demand.
Chinese vehicles are now seen all across Mexico, especially in the largest cities, like here in the capital. Hola, señor. Sales of Chinese vehicles in Mexico have been on the rise in recent years, and they now account for 12% of total market sales in this country.
The president of Mexico's National Association of Automotive Distributors, Guillermo Rosales, says Chinese vehicles are popular in Mexico because they offer good prices and attractive new technologies.
I have to remember that Chinese automakers control key battery materials. They refine more than half the world's lithium and cobalt, and they assemble 75% of lithium-ion cells. And that scale drives battery costs to under US $100 per kilowatt. Competitive brands in Europe struggle to hit $120 US per kilowatt. Thanks to that edge, BYD launched a model at $22,000 with a 55 kilowatt battery packing 420 kilometers of range. And other brands price at 50 kilowatt pack at about $28,000 US. You see where the cost savings are actually going. Mexico's government trimmed import duties and sped up certification. Dealers pre-ordered tens of thousands of units in 2024, the last quarter of 2024, to beat any future tariff hike. And that stockpiled inventory flooded the lots in early 2025. You walk into showrooms and found 10 models under US $25,000.
The average price for a new car in Mexico is around $27,000. Products made in China fall into this price range nicely. This gives Chinese vehicles a strong acceptance here. 1 out of every 5 cars sold in Mexico are made in China.
Rosales expects no major drop this year in Chinese vehicle sales in Mexico.
Sí veo debilidad en algunas marcas.
Sometimes there is a deficiency in available parts. It's important that they listen to consumers and distributors alike.
But trade tensions, due in great part to tariff impositions, are expected to slow economic growth in Mexico. Some automotive industry experts here say that will likely also slow Mexican demand for Chinese-made vehicles in 2026.
Okay, so let's look at some quick sales data. In Q1 2025, EV registration hit about 48,000 units, up from 25,000 in Q1 of 2024. Chinese brands accounted for about 32,000 of those sales. Dealers passed the savings to you, and that meant more choice and cheaper discounts, sometimes up to $3,000 off. Every 1,000 EVs sold supports around 15 local jobs in dealerships, charging station bills, and maintenance. With 48,000 EVs sold in Q1, Mexico saw roughly 720 new roles tied directly to EV retail and infrastructure that supports local mechanics, electricians, and construction crews. Auto exports now represent 15% of Mexico's GDP, up from 11% 3 years ago. A chunk of that growth comes from export of parts and assembly of EVs under TMEC. You actually benefit when your neighbor lands a job wiring a fast charger. Higher EV numbers cut tailpipe emissions. Mexico saw a 5% drop in PM 2.5 levels in early 2025 compared to that of early 2023. And that's a win for your lungs and your kids' health. Reduced pollution also trims public health spending by millions. Research also showed charging networks grew by 25% in the first half of 2025. You can drive from Mexico City to Querétaro with minimal stops. And that expansion makes EV ownership practical beyond major cities. Now, let's take a shift to Canada. A top business analyst warns Canada may need to prepare for exiting the auto industry. Canada ships 75% of its vehicles to the United States. New U.S. tariff on light vehicles could trim North American sales by 2 million units this year. That risks up to $5 billion in lost vehicle exports. And Canada's EV share lags at 5% of new sales. Contrast that with Mexico's 10%. Canadian automakers face complex federal and provincial incentive schemes that vary by province. Incentives cap often kick in before you break US $40,000, far below the $22,000 entry price in Mexico. Before we go any further, take a look at this news feature from CTV News.
Good morning, Anne-Marie.
We know that Canada's relationship with China has been tense. It was wrapped up by those 2024 tariffs on Chinese EVs, steel and aluminum products, and then China retaliated, as we just mentioned. But the Chinese ambassador to Beijing said that China wants to partner with Canada to push back against American bullying, is how they described it. Why would it make sense to remove restrictions on China, or what would need to happen for this relationship to improve?
This is an excellent question because, of course, China is the second largest economy on planet Earth, $19 trillion GDP, second only to the United States at 30 trillion. Huge market because no country is self-sufficient. China is no exception. They're the largest importer of natural gas, for example, huge importer of agricultural products. So to your question, we at Canada adopted the 100% tariff and to be in sync, if you will, with American policy. President Biden, not Trump, not here to defend Trump at all, but it was Biden who put the 100% tariff on EVs. And there's a reason for that. And I've been teaching in China since 1997, once a year in an MBA program. And I've ridden in many different Chinese EVs because my students pick me up at the hotel to take me to the class each day, and they take turns. And when you look at the IEA data, China has 60% world market share in EVs. Why? Because they're far less expensive and they're of better quality. And the American and the Europeans are not competitive in EVs. So that's why they put this tariff on. However, when you drill down, we are not making small EVs. The Chinese make a Seagull that's $15,000. And so the idea that it would be a threat to our auto industry is problematic because we produce overwhelmingly huge vehicles, 2-ton SUVs and F-150 trucks and that sort of thing.
If you passed an EV mandate and you want to protect local jobs here or a local auto industry, why not negotiate with China to bring their factories here so you could have more jobs if the main objective was to go 100% electric by 2035? That was the main goal. But again, what we did, we interjected, we became very reactive. And as a result, it's now affecting everyone because people are pushing back against the prices. The prices are not very competitive, but he'll explain further.
And as a consequence, we've alienated the Chinese and they've slapped significant tariffs on a sector that's very important to Canada, which is natural resources and agriculture. So there's the broad argument.
Let's bring agriculture into this discussion because we've spoken with canola farmers who say they were frustrated that the federal government put this tariff on EVs knowing that it would come back on them, and it did. In order for this relationship to improve on the auto sector, what would canola farmers be calling for?
Let me just go back to the auto sector for a moment. President Trump has thus far, from the very beginning until now, has been consistent on one thing. He said the U.S. doesn't need our cars, they don't want Canada to make cars, and so there are very profound, serious questions of whether the car industry, manufacturing industry, will remain in Canada. The industry itself and former Prime Minister Trudeau said, if the 25% tariffs remain in place, the auto industry is finished. It's not sustainable. I agree with that assessment, by the way. We've got to start preparing for the day when we are maybe possibly going to exit auto industry. As horrible as that will be to people in Southern Ontario, Australia did it in the late 90s. It didn't devastate Australia. Australia is now higher average income per capita than we are in Canada. But we've got to start preparing for that day. And we've got to diversify, as we all know, our exports, such as, oh my goodness, agricultural exports to China. So that's one of the reasons, I think, why we've got to start looking at this and saying...
And to be fair, we have to look at the recent reports in the news in the auto industry here in Canada. Honda paused a US $1 billion EV battery investment in Ontario earlier this year, citing regulatory uncertainty. Toyota cut planned spending on local EV supply chains by 20%. Those moves raise the red flags for jobs and capacity. And it's no wonder this analyst is saying Canada's auto sector risk and exit. Mexico moved faster. They cut import red tape, offered land subsidies near ports, and streamlined permitting. Canada's patchwork of incentives and slower approvals add cost and time. You feel that at the dealership when limited EV stocks drive prices up. In Mexico, you see subcompact EVs start at $22,000 with a 350-kilometer range. A midsize SUV with 450 kilometers sits at around $30,000. You get wireless phone charging, 10-inch infotainment systems, and standard driver aid. In Canada, comparable models start at about $45,000, and that buys you only 300 kilometers of range. Federal rebates of $5,000 apply only to vehicles under $55,000, and some provinces add up to $8,000, but those drop off after $65,000. You end up near $40,000 before extras. BYD plans a $500 million plant in Mexico by 2026. And that aims to cut shipping costs and shave off another 10% off the price. Expect a compact model at about $20,000. MG and JAC are scouting joint venture assembly deals. In Canada, Ford and GM pledged about $14 billion into EV battery plants by 2028. But the project approvals lags and construction won't hit full stride until 2026. You won't see new Canadian-made EVs below $35,000 until then. If you live in Mexico, you get EVs under $25,000 with solid range and up-to-the-date tech. Fast chargers are growing, local jobs are up, air quality is up, and that paints a very clear picture. More freedom to choose, lower running costs, and local economic gains. If you live in Canada, you face higher entry prices, patchy infrastructure, and policy shifts. You pay about $40,000 to $50,000 for an EV with only 350-kilometer range. And incentives vary by province. Chargers outside Ontario and Quebec remain scarce. Your next EV decision may hinge on cross-border incentives or waiting on local assembly plants. Look at bundled deals or corporate lease options to offset the higher cost. Mexico's EV boom shows how fast pricing, policy, and supply chain can reshape an industry. Chinese brands give you a clear advantage. Advanced tech at lower cost. Canada faces a tougher road. Without faster incentives and clearer policy, it risks losing its auto edge. If you're in the market, weigh Mexico's options against Canada's outlook. Drop your pick below and let's keep this conversation rolling. I will catch you in the next episode, so until next time.